Yep, you heard that right. The before mix hanging around 14.7 LUFS, and now it's blasting at a whopping negative 8.1 LUFS. Long-term integrated, it maxes out at negative 6.2 LUFS, but you need to guess what? Guess what? The artist loved it, the mixing engineer loved it, and it sounds absolutely insane. Even at full volume, everything's punching and coming through. So, I need you to not forget to smash the like button and subscribe, because in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I did this. The first thing I always try and do is buy headroom. Now, I'm going to use the word buy because every process is always a trade-off. And if you're conscious that every process you're trading off with either the fidelity or the integrity of the mix, you start to think like a mastering engineer. Not only do you use critical listening to inform your decisions, but also your knowledge of your tools and how they interact and impact the sound of a mix. So throughout this walkthrough, while we're adding plugins to the chain, I'm going to keep a tally of how each process affects the overall loudness. And we're going to do that by subtracting the peak value from the long-term integrated loudness of the whole master. So what's my first purchase for headroom? We are going to buy some headroom using a clipper. Now, I usually start with manual limiting or clipping, but for this session, I chose clipping, and I'll show you the waveform. Now, all the peaks are consistent. Drums, snare hits, happening consistently. Sometimes if there's an offshoot of one peak, I don't bother to clip at all. I just go in and manually edit it. But here, every peak is very consistent, very easy to manage. And how I dial this in is I actually use the declip mode in Audio Editor to give me a visual representation of where all the peaks are. Now, I use a negative 6 decibels for this session. I use negative 6 decibels on the clipper, so you can see all the peaks it's clipping. And you're probably wondering, there's about 3-4 dozen peaks that you're clipping. Are you going to hear it? Go to the loudest peak. The loudest peak is negative 1.2 decibels over here. Okay, or over here. How many samples do you reckon that is? Okay, let's zoom in. And this is the beauty of Audio Editor. You can actually see all the sample points. That's a total of 32 samples. 30 samples divided by 48,000. You're in the thousandth of a second that clipping is occurring. So any of the distortions, any of the harmonics being introduced is on a very micro scale. And I actually went through and looked before this video to see what was the longest amount of samples clipped at any one stage. And it actually happens just after that initial peak there. Let's go across there. 65 samples. So that's still within 1,000th of a second that it's clipping in any single instance. So it's inaudible. You won't hear that clipping. And to show you this, let's actually listen, turning the clipper off and then back on. That's ridiculously subtle. Maybe it's just taking a little bit of the poke out of it, but really the mix is holding together nicely. And with just 62 consecutive samples clipped at any one stage at 1,000th of a second, the trade-off for that, to get 5 decibels of additional gain, is what I call a bargain when we're discussing the trade-off. To keep with our tally, we're now at negative 10 LUFS overall. Not everything's all about loudness. I wanted to create a bit of separation between the sustain of the guitars and the smack of the drums. So I set up this compressor here, okay, the Kotelnikov. You know I love this compressor, it's awesome. And I use a relatively slow attack time, relatively slow release, and that was just allowing me to tuck the sustain of the guitars behind the smack of the drums. Now, this didn't get me any extra loudness. If anything, it might have put me back a few fractions of a LUF. However, it was mainly about feel and getting the feel of this master right, because I'm not willing to sacrifice the loudness for feel. So take a listen to this and get an idea for how it's sitting, the pocket it makes it sit in, because this is part of the chain, and I had to share this with you because it's not always just about making it as loud as possible. Now, that compressor brought us back to a total of negative 10 LUFS. Following that compressor, I wanted to add some depth to the overall master. We're dealing with live drums, and I wanted it to feel like the kick was subtly bleeding into both the left and right channels. So have a listen to the side channel with this turned off, Bassline Pro turned off. I don't get any bleed from the kick. And I think the drum bus might have had an elliptical filter on the subs, and none of that punch or movement is happening out on the sides. But fear not, you know I love Bassline Pro for exactly this. Take the mid signal, add some harmonics to the side signal, and then blend it in. Okay, so it's just moving a bit of those drums out the side, especially the transient stuff from the kick and some of the snare in the middle. It's just giving it a little bit out the stereo field. Now have a listen to this before and after, because I really like what this does to the overall master. I love the way that it gives it this nice breadth and depth to the overall mix. It actually pulled the overall loudness. It actually created a few more peaks, especially between the left and right channel, and the overall loudness has went down to negative 11.3. Next in the chain was this Sontec 432. Now, believe it or not, this low shelf EQ here for negative 1 decibel was actually at the request by the client. They felt as though the first master I sent them was a little bit too much subs in it. And in hindsight, I actually agree. There were too much subs in it, so this is a really cool move, this negative 1 decibel of 50 hertz. But I did boost it's a half dB boosted around 740 hertz to help that guitar and vocal just sit a little bit more aggressively in your face. So when you're playing it through, it just feels like it's hitting you a little bit. Now, when it comes to the two models, the analog models of the 432, there's the pure analog and the aggressive analog mode. I tend to prefer the aggressive analog, as when I'm aiming to add a little bit more edge to a signal, this just, I feel, and feel isn't a good word to use, but because it's not objective, it's not measurable, this does add more fourth and fifth order harmonics, but it's so micro, you really shouldn't be able to hear it. However, I just use the aggressive analog mode when I want a little bit more edge, okay, a little bit more edge. Let's have a listen to this, all right? Might not be as exciting now, but as we start to drive the signal, it makes a lot more sense, because there is quite a lot of low-end energy there. But overall, this 432 EQ move just helps bump our LUFS up a little bit to negative 11. I was also listening through this in the mastering session, and I wanted the snare to pop a little bit more. To make the snare pop and really stand out, I employed using the impact module. Let's have a listen to the delta signal to hear exactly what this is doing. Okay, now let's listen to it before and after, without the impact module, and then with. And doing that subtle process, it's only adding like half a decibel at single instances in that frequency range. It didn't change the overall loudness reading. So we're still at negative 11 LUFS. Then I've used the maximizer with no more than a decibel of limiting using the transient mode. And why transient mode, you ask? Well, I feel like this particular mode gives me the best low-end extension, and that's really important. To give it that extra oomph, we're using the soft clipper here on medium mode, and that helps us bring us to our negative 8.1 LUFS. And that's really important. This here helps us get us to that final loudness, that soft clipping, which is really important. And there's also a little Easter egg at the end of this, because you're probably wondering, if you're not using true peak mode, you're definitely going over 0 decibels. And here's the thing. This is a trick I learned from somebody I know, and I had to do it to believe it. I used True Peak Limit Mode in Maximizer, and I've always used True Peak Limit Mode in Maximizer, and they told me use True Peak Mode in Maximizer on a separate Maximizer, but just have the ceiling set to 0 decibels, okay? Like this. And they go, it will sound better, trust me. And I thought, well, that's bullshit. You just use the True Peak one there. Why would you have to use a second one? It won't work any different. but trust me, I did some blind tests. It actually sounds better. So the overall peak level of this 8.1 Lufs Master is 0 decibel. Now let's have another listen to this before I give you my final thoughts. That's how we boosted the final Lufs of a mix, which was -14, -15 Lufs, all the way up to 8 Lufs. If you're interested in exploring mastering more, here are 2 videos where I break down some really interesting techniques regarding mastering and processing. So click on one of them and enjoy.